Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're fast-forwarding to a thrilling, high-stakes geopolitical scenario. We're going to unpack the forecasted Middle East crisis of April 2026. It's a highly plausible situation where global diplomacy gets turned completely on its head and a totally unexpected player steps up to the plate. Let's dive right in.
Okay, picture this. It's early April 2026. U.S. President Donald Trump issues a massive ultimatum to Iran. Open the Strait of Hormuz or face the destruction of a whole civilization. The entire world is basically holding its breath, bracing for absolute devastation. But right on the brink, out of nowhere, a Pakistani general, Field Marshal Asim Munir, makes a critical phone call to Washington and Tehran. And within hours, incredibly, a ceasefire is announced.
Now, when a crisis of this magnitude hits, you'd usually expect the traditional heavyweights to swoop in, right? But look at what actually happens here. European powers are taking a massive economic hit from the strait closing, but they kind of just offer statements of concern. Nothing more. China? They recently brokered peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but they stay completely on the sidelines for this one. Even India says no thanks. So with all these global giants totally paralyzed, we really have to ask, who actually stepped in to stop this catastrophic war?
That brings us to Section 1, the April 2026 crisis and an unexpected savior.
20. That's the magic number here. In this scenario, within days of the ceasefire, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance sits across from Iranian negotiators for more than 20 hours. And think about how wild that is, the highest level direct contact between the U.S. and Iran since the 1979 revolution happens. But it doesn't happen in Geneva or Paris. It happens in Islamabad, Pakistan. Literally a geographic twist nobody saw coming.
You know, traditionally, if you want to broker global peace, you need a really specific resume. You're talking major power status, massive economic weight, liberal democratic credentials, and the authority to convene other nations. Pakistan? They've historically lacked all of that. They're a nuclear-armed state, sure, but they sit on the fringes of the Western order, with a limited economy, and they're often associated with regional instability. Yet, in this crisis scenario, Pakistan somehow pulls off a diplomatic miracle that the traditional heavyweights just couldn't.
All right, moving to Section 2, failing traditional diplomacy, the collapse of the old order.
So why did the usual powers fail here? Well, it points to a pretty grim reality. The old diplomatic toolkit is just broken. Just look at recent history. We saw the most punishing Western sanctions ever, plus billions in military aid, and it still couldn't stop Russia's war in Ukraine from dragging into its 5th year. Look at Gaza. Endless UN Security Council diplomacy failed to halt a 3-year war. And in the Red Sea, massive naval coalitions couldn't even protect global trade. The old methods, they are officially obsolete.
The absolute crucial takeaway for anyone paying attention to global politics right now is this. Pooling your military and economic weight to just bully adversaries into submission, it doesn't work in today's multipolar world. The old strategy of using this tight circle of like-minded allies to wall off conflicts is literally a liability now. You simply can't solve modern crises by only talking to your friends.
Let's dive into Section 3, Why Pakistan Succeeded, the Anatomy of a Non-Traditional Power. Breaking down Pakistan's success, we actually get a brand new blueprint for global mediation. But it requires this highly specific, almost contradictory cocktail of 3 things: meaningful cross-cutting relationships, credible coercive power, and fiercely risk-tolerant leadership. Let's look at how Pakistan activated all 3.
Step 1 is basically a masterclass in geopolitical acrobatics, relationships. Islamabad somehow manages to keep a tight strategic bond with China and a strict alignment with Saudi Arabia. But at the exact same time, they're chasing U.S. favor, and they share physical borders and deep religious ties with Iran. Because Pakistan isn't fully in anyone's pocket, they aren't a treaty ally or an outright enemy to Washington or Tehran, they become the only acceptable middleman when the two sides desperately need to talk.
Now, steps 2 and 3, that requires real leverage and a massive appetite for risk. Through a mutual defense pact with Riyadh, Pakistan actually wields a credible threat. If Iran escalates, Pakistan could legitimately drag other Muslim-majority states into the fight. That is immense leverage. But, you need someone bold enough to actually use it. Enter Field Marshal Asim Munir. Riding high on this personal rapport he built with President Trump after a 2025 conflict with India, Munir risks his hard-won political capital to aggressively force both sides to the table. Which brings us to Section 4, the new stabilizing powers and how a global pattern emerges. So Pakistan here isn't just an anomaly. This is actually part of a huge new geopolitical trend called order-stabilizing statecraft. It's what happens when underdog states step up to fill the void left by broken multilateral institutions, like the UN. They use their weird intersecting alliances to build trust. They create pockets of stability and open back channels between bitter enemies who absolutely refuse to be in the same room. They are, effectively, the new peacekeepers.
And we are seeing this play out everywhere. Qatar hosts a massive U.S. military base, but also hosts Hamas leaders to mediate hostage releases. Turkey leverages its unique ties to both Moscow and Kyiv to secure the Black Sea grain deal, literally averting a global food crisis. You've got Egypt managing the incredibly complex Rafah crossing, while Oman and Saudi Arabia are quietly de-escalating the Red Sea. These non-traditional powers are stepping into the void all across the globe.
Finally, Section 5. Adapting the diplomatic playbook. A new strategy for the U.S.
For global superpowers, the absolute core takeaway here is radical flexibility. The U.S. can't afford to only work with pure democracies or countries that share its exact values anymore. To survive without getting constantly dragged into these costly wars, the U.S. has to cross the aisle. Think about it. For years, Washington ignored Pakistan in favor of India. But in this 2026 crisis scenario, abandoning that rigid loyalty is exactly the thing that averts World War III.
This quote really hits the nail on the head. Ultimately, maintaining global order requires a vastly broadened portfolio of relationships. You can no longer neatly categorize the world into traditional friends and foes. Yes, long-standing allies are still incredibly important, for sure, but keeping the peace is increasingly going to depend on states that sit way outside that comfortable inner circle. The outliers, they are becoming essential.
So as we watch the old unipolar order fade out, we're left with a massive, fascinating question. How will established superpowers survive and thrive in a world where they aren't the ones dictating the peace anymore? It's a jarring reality check, right? But as this Islamabad scenario shows us, the most effective peacemakers of tomorrow might just come from the places we least expect. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep an eye on those outliers.